Welcome back to the Divorcee or Remarriage podcast. We're going to talk about the exception clause today. One thing I have not done in my prior videos is done much of a word study. So I thought today we would look at the exception clause as it relates to divorce and remarriage and do a little word study on that exception clause. So what is the exception clause? Well, we find it in Matthew 5:32 and in Matthew 19:9. In both those passages, Jesus refers to a remarriage, a divorce and a remarriage, as adultery. And he says if you divorce and you remarry, it's adultery, but there's an exception clause. And the exception clause says, except on the grounds of sexual immorality. You can see it here on your screen there. It's the blue text. And the blue text, except on the ground of sexual immorality, that is the Greek word for fornication, sexual immorality. The word is porneia, and it can refer to all kinds of sexual conduct, illicit sexual conduct, or it can refer to just one kind. And it would refers to one kind, it's typically, you can tell it from the context of the passage that it's talking about just one kind. If it doesn't have anything in the context to narrow it to one kind, it's probably all kinds of illicit sexual conduct. So that's what the word porneia there in the exception clause. And now that word is different than the word for adultery. So Jesus says that divorce and remarriage is adultery, and the word for adultery is moichea, and that's a different word. That has to do with a situation where somebody has sex with somebody other than their spouse, so that they're married to somebody and they have sex with somebody else who is not their spouse. And so what's interesting about that here in Matthew 5:32 is we have porneia for sexual immorality in the exception clause, and then we have adultery, moichea, in the same verse. So it makes you think, I wonder if this is talking about two different things, or what does that mean? They're similar kind of words, but they're a little different. And so what do these two words mean? Here we see the same thing happening in Matthew 19:9. I should mention the exception clauses are only in the book of Matthew, which is also kind of interesting. It's Matthew 5:32, and then here in Matthew 19:9. And again, in Matthew 5:32, it imagines a man divorcing a woman, and then she remarries, and her remarrying is adultery. And in Matthew 19:9, it's a man divorces a woman, and then he remarries. So in Matthew 5:32, she remarries. Matthew 19:9, he remarries. That's the difference there. But in both cases, the remarriage is adultery, and in both cases, they have the exception clause for porneia. Here it says, except for sexual immorality. So I want to talk about two views regarding what this exception clause means. And to point out those two views, I have changed the text of the exception clause. This would not be proper to have in a Bible, to have it this way. We're just changing it so we can understand what people are thinking when they have these two different views of the exception clause. So the two views, the first one is where Jesus says, and I say to you, whosoever divorces his wife, except if she cheated on him, and marries another, commits adultery. So that imagines the woman and a third party. If she cheats on him, he can divorce and remarry her. If she does not cheat on him and he divorces and he remarries, and he commits adultery. Okay, here's the other way of viewing the exception clause. And I say to you, whosoever divorces his wife, except if it's a sinful second marriage and marries another, commits adultery. So here, what it's imagining is that the porneia is not the woman and a third party, it's the husband and wife. That a man and woman are married, but their marriage is porneia. Their marriage is the sin. And so Jesus is saying, well, if your marriage is the sin, if you have a sinful marriage, if you have an invalid marriage because it was sexually sinful to enter, well, then you could divorce that and you could marry somebody else because it's not a valid marriage. That's the concept here behind the second view. So really the question is, with whom is the sexual immorality? Is the sexual immorality between the wife and a third party, or the husband and the wife? And now you'll notice, if we just go back here one screen, Matthew 19:9, it's what the text says is, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. You'll notice the exception clause, except for sexual immorality, it doesn't tell you with whom. It doesn't tell you who. Somebody did something, but it doesn't tell you who, except for sexual immorality. With who? Was it the husband and wife? Or was it the wife and a third party? those are really the two options. The husband and a third party, nobody thinks that's the case, because that would mean that a man uh, has some kind of ability, right to divorce and remarry because he cheated on his wife. Nobody thinks that makes any sense, so nobody believes that view. So really, all you have is the wife and a third party, or the husband and wife. Now let's look at something called the Damascus Document. The Damascus Document was found in 1897 in Cairo, Egypt, and it was later found after 1946-47, but as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls near Qumran, about 14 miles east of Jerusalem by the Dead Sea there. And this is near the Essene establishment, where they had roughly about 120 guys living in what today would look very much like a monastery. Of course, they probably didn't call it that at the time, but they did a lot of writing. They did a lot of what we would call baptism. They had mikvahs where they would wash themselves, and they had like all these documents talking about how they would wash themselves, and they would change into white, and then they would have a very solemn meal, and they would go back to work, and they wouldn't talk very much, and they were very strict with their rules, very strict with their rules. Anyway, and this document was found near them as well. I'm going to read it, and I want you to note the ways in which some of it sounds very close to what Jesus says. During all those years, Belial shall be unleashed against Israel, as he spoke by the hand of Isaiah, son of Amos, saying, terror and the pit and snare are upon you, O inhabitant of the land. Interpreted, these are the three nets of Belial, with which Levi, the son of Jacob, said that he catches Israel by setting them up as three kinds of righteousness. The first is fornication. This is the first net, is fornication. That's the net we care about for our purposes here. The second is riches, and the third is profanation of the temple. Whoever escapes the first is caught in the second. Whoever saves himself from the second is caught in the third. The builders of the wall who have followed precept. Precept was a spouter, of whom it is written, they shall surely spout. Okay, here we go. This is the portion that matters. Shall be caught in fornication twice by taking a second wife while the first is alive. Whereas the principle of creation is male and female created he them. Also those who entered the ark went in 2 by 2. And concerning the prince it is written, he shall not multiply wives to himself. Okay, so we're gonna just remember all of that here for a moment. We're gonna go on to our next screen. All right, we're gonna compare some phrases from the Damascus Document and the New Testament to look at the overlap. Now, a lot of people have noticed how similar the concepts are in the Damascus Document and what we have in the New Testament about divorce and remarriage. So, in the Damascus Document, it says, shall be caught in fornication twice by taking a second wife. Second wife, right? We're talking about a remarriage, a second marriage. The New Testament talks about remarriage being adultery, and it's usually repeated. What I mean by that is in Matthew 5, Matthew 19, Mark 10, and Luke 16. Those are the 4 places in the Gospels where we have remarriage being called adultery. And in 3 of those 4, it talks about 2 different moral formulations. So, for example, in Matthew 5:32, it says that if a man divorces his wife, except to be for fornication, he causes her to commit adultery. That's one time. And the second time is, it says, a man who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So he has 2 moral formulations there, and both of them are adultery. So in that sense, it says remarriage is adultery, and it says it in 2 different ways. And then Damascus Document, it says, shall be caught in fornication twice by taking a second wife. So we have that twice concept there. In the Damascus Document, it says, while the first is alive. The idea is a second marriage is fornication if it is done while the first is alive. Now, I want you to notice, it doesn't say while they're not divorced. It says while the first is alive. I don't think they thought divorce mattered at all. The point was, is she alive? Yes. Okay, you marry somebody else, it's sexual sin. That was their whole point. In the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 7:39, we have something similar in Romans 7. Paul writes, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. So that's the idea. While the first is alive, in the Damascus Document, as long as he lives, is what we see in the New Testament. All right, and then finally in the Damascus Document, it tells us the reason why the second marriage is sexual sin. Here's why. Whereas the principle of creation is male and female created he them. Also those who entered the ark went in 2 by 2. And concerning the prince, it is written, he shall not multiply wives to himself. So they give three reasons, three concepts of two, male and female, went into the ark 2 by 2, and the prince shall not multiply wives to himself. In other words, just one wife, which would mean there'd be two of them. And in Matthew 19:4-6, Jesus says something very similar. He who created them from the beginning made them male and female. So that's the same as the male and female in the Damascus document. And said, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother. So that's another two, father and mother, and shall hold fast to his wife. Another two, married husband and wife. And the two shall become one flesh. So there are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. So there's that emphasis on two. So both Jesus and the Damascus document, their premise is this concept from Genesis, where the idea is to, or in Deuteronomy, Damascus document brings in Deuteronomy there, but from Moses, basically, because he wrote both Genesis and Deuteronomy, the idea of 222, right? That's the premise, and therefore, if you take another wife, if you remarry, it's sexual sin while the first one is alive. So that's the argument, both from the Damascus document and the New Testament. There's no extra biblical evidence that comes anywhere close to mirroring what Jesus said, quite like the Damascus document. It's very close to what Jesus said there. All right. So now what you see on your screen, on the left side is the Damascus document in Hebrew. Now we're getting into the word study side of this. On the right side is the Damascus document translated into English. And I have here the Hebrew word and the English word for fornication. This is illicit sexual sin. So it's the word fornication. It's not the word for adultery. It's not the Hebrew word for adultery. It's the Hebrew word for fornication. They're two different words. One is fornication, one is adultery. Two different words in Hebrew, and they're also two different words in Greek. Okay, so I just wanted to show that to you so you can see the exact Hebrew word there. And then we're going to look at what does this Hebrew word mean in Hebrew, right? And so you can see it there. It means fornication, unfaithfulness. That's just what it means. And you can see on the bottom in the lower left, most of the time, vast majority of the time, high percentage, it's translated in the Old Testament as fornication because that's what the word means. And other times it's unfaithfulness and whoredom, which, similar concept. Okay. Now on the right side, what you see is a different word. This is a Hebrew word for adultery. So you'll know it's a different word for adultery. And here you can see how it's translated: adultery, adulteress, who commits adultery. Okay, so you get the idea. It's adultery, right? So the point is, these are two very different words. That's the whole point. So in the Damascus document, they intentionally use the word fornication, not the word for adultery. So this is going to be important here in a moment. Okay. So here's the question. Why the different word choices? This is a clue. So in the Damascus document is written in Hebrew, and the New Testament is written in Greek. The Damascus document has no exception clause. There's no exception clause. New Testament has an exception clause, and it uses fornication for the exception clause, right? But the Damascus document calls the second marriage fornication. It does not use the word for adultery. The New Testament calls the second marriage adultery, not fornication. So you see how it's using a different word? In the exception clause in Matthew 5:32, Matthew 19:9, that's where fornication is. But the actual second marriage, it's calling that adultery. The Damascus document doesn't use the word adultery at all. So what's with the different word choices? Well, how do we explain this word selection choice? Okay. So now I'm going to go through 6 different possible explanations, and the 6th one is the one I think is true. Okay, so the first idea is, well, it's just sexual sin. The words are interchangeable. Maybe, but I doubt it. I mean, when you look at the 7 times Jesus refers to remarriage, he calls it adultery. In Mark, he calls it adultery. In Luke, he calls it adultery. In Matthew, he calls it adultery. When Paul writes Romans 7 and talks about a second marriage, he says it'll make her an adulteress, using a derivative or another type of word from that same word, moichea. So I think the remarriage being adultery, I think that they use that term for a reason. And in both exception clauses, they use the word fornication. And the word fornication and the word for adultery are used in the same verses in Matthew 5:32, Matthew 19:9. They use fornication for the exception clause and then the remarriage is adultery. They could have used the same word for both, or they could have been interchanged. We're not seeing a lot of interchanging. The only thing that's different is fornication is in the exception clause. Now, why is that? We're going to keep talking about that here in a moment. Here's another explanation. Maybe the Essenes didn't really have Jesus' view. They just objected to polygamy, not remarriage. And why would you say that? Well, they don't talk about divorce there. Jesus talks about divorce, but the Essenes don't talk about divorce. But I think that really misses the boat, because the Essenes talked about while the first wife was still alive, that was the way you determine whether or not the second marriage was a problem or not. And it was two fornications if the person got into a second marriage while the first was alive. So I don't think I mean, yes, it's true. I'm sure they objected to polygamy. You can tell that from the text. But also, it seems like they thought divorces didn't divorce. That's what Jesus appears to think, that really a divorce and remarriage is polygamy, because that's the only way it could be adultery, is if the divorce didn't really end the first marriage. So I don't think saying that they only objected to polygamy and not divorce and remarriage really makes sense with the actual Damascus document text. Another possibility is that the Essenes just had a different view than Jesus. So we just need to not look at the Damascus document, not worry about that. And I just think that's really not plausible. I mean, this is a document that's contemporary with Jesus. It uses the exact same argument. Jesus was in the area of the Essenes from time to time. I mean, the Jordan River is not that far. Jerusalem's not that far. Yeah, a lot of the places Jesus was at. I mean, John the Baptist has a lot of like Essene vibes. We can just say people have noticed that. I'm not saying that he wasn't Essene. I don't think he was, but there's a lot of similarity going on there. The Essenes had lots of water stuff going on. John the Baptist is all with the baptism, and Jesus does the baptism. There's a lot of Essene stuff going on. There's other views Jesus has that you also see from the Essenes, like, for example, not taking oaths. So I think now, and there are some views from the Essenes that Jesus does not have. They're strict with the Sabbath. Jesus is not strict with the Sabbath. It was very hard to enter in with the in group with the Essenes, and Jesus made it relatively easy to join his group. So I'm not saying that Jesus was an Essene, but it's just pretty clear that the view the Essenes had is the same view that Jesus had. Then what about, going to the top right of our chart here, what about remarriage is a subset of adultery, and therefore the Essenes wrote fornication? So it is true that remarriage is a subset of adultery, right? Jesus says somebody divorces and remarries, that's adultery. So that's a type of adultery. That's what I mean by subset. It's one type of adultery. But that doesn't really make sense as to why that would cause the Essenes to write fornication. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It just seems like a non sequitur kind of an argument there. So I don't think that really explains much of anything. The next possibility is that the Essenes thought a man remarrying isn't technically adultery. They thought it was fornication, not adultery. I think that is just not really likely. That would mean that the Essenes and Jesus had different views on this, and I think that is just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The whole reason why it's sexual sin is because the man is still married to the first spouse. Obviously, they're okay with the first marriage. They have no problem with the first marriage. They even talk about the first marriage there in the Damascus document. So I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is that he's married to a second person while the first one is alive, which by definition is adultery. So I don't think that's the problem. Here's what I think the problem was. Here's what I think the reason is, I should say, the explanation. There were two sins. One was adultery and the other was not adultery. So let's go back. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. If you go back to the Damascus document, here in the upper left, it says, shall be caught in fornication twice by taking a second wife. There's two fornications going on. In other words, there's two types of sexual sins going on. One of those is the remarriage, which is adultery, fornication, whatever. And the second one is something else that's sexual sin, but is not adultery. So let me give you an example of what that might be. In Matthew 5:32, Jesus says if a man divorces his wife, except for fornication, he makes her commit adultery. He makes her commit adultery. Now, I want you to notice, scholars have noticed this, making somebody else commit adultery is not the same as committing adultery. Both of those things would kind of fall under the general concept of sexual sin, but one is making somebody else commit sexual sin, the actual sin, and the other one is actually doing it oneself. So the reason why I think the Damascus document uses the word fornication is because it's trying to use a word that is broad enough to capture both sins. One is adultery, the other one is something else they have in mind. It could be like the man causing his first wife to commit adultery because he's going to divorce her and she goes and has sex with somebody else, marries some other guy. It could be that. It could be something else they have in mind. But here's the point. There's two sins, one being adultery and the other one being something else sexually sinful. And so that's why they use the word fornication. So it's broad enough to encompass both. Instead of outlining, adultery and this other sexual type of sin, instead of saying that, they just use one word, fornication, to cover both of the sins that they're trying to cover in one word. So that's the reason why they use fornication here. And Jesus uses the word adultery because they're trying to cover two sins with one word. And Jesus is only referring to one sin at that point in time. So if we go back down here, once you see my little red arrow down to the bottom, and what this results in is at the time Jesus spoke, in the context of second marriages, fornication was a word known to refer to a sinful second marriage. That's the whole point. So here's the hypothesis. Jesus used the word fornication in the exception clause. That's a fact. Damascus document used fornication to refer to a sinful second marriage. Also a fact. Therefore, when Jesus said fornication in the exception clause, he meant a sinful second marriage. That's what people would have thought he meant. He's obviously giving an Essene-based argument, or I shouldn't say based. What he's saying, he's affirming that they're correct. Jesus also affirmed that the Pharisees were correct, that there was a resurrection. He also affirmed the Pharisees were correct, that the law and the prophets were inspired scripture. The Sadducees didn't believe the prophets were inspired scripture. Jesus and the Pharisees did. So just because Jesus happens to agree with somebody doesn't mean he's learned from them or anything like that. So he's just affirming the Essenes are correct, and he's giving an Essene argument. Because the Essenes had the right argument on this. So the point is, he's giving the Essene argument, and then he uses the word fornication in the context of an Essene argument. People would know he meant, by fornication, a sinful second marriage. So then somebody might have an objection to this. They might say, well, that's nice and tidy, but if it's true, why did Jesus use adultery instead of fornication to refer to a remarriage? And the answer is because he could have used the word fornication for both the exception clause and the remarriage, right? Well, adultery is technically the correct term for both, but Jesus used fornication for the exception clause to make it clear he took the view associated with the Essenes and not with Rabbi Shammai. And of course, then this also would make it so that all the Pharisees would understand by adultery, he's talking about an invalid remarriage that ought to be divorced. All right, so that's how I would respond to that objection. But here's the bottom line. As far as I know, and if you know differently, put it in the comments. Send me an email. My email address is divorceyourremarriage@gmail.com. If you have more information, I'd love to hear it. But as far as I know, besides Jesus, the only other time someone uses fornication in reference to the debate around second marriages is the Damascus document. In the Damascus document, a sinful second marriage is called fornication. Therefore, the best extra-biblical evidence we have points to fornication in the exception clause to refer to a sinful second marriage. Now, why is it if you read John Calvin, you're not going to see this? Why is it if you read Matthew Henry's fantastic commentary, you're not going to see this? The reason why you're not going to see this is because they did not have the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Damascus document was found in Egypt in 1897. John Calvin was not around anymore. The Puritans were not around. The Westminster Confession of Faith was written well before 1897. They did not have this information. So I think that to the extent that extra biblical information can help us understand what was meant by the scripture, we have to be able to take the extra biblical information and use that and not just revere our kind of pantheon of great guys from the past. And I don't mean to make light of them. I think they have tremendous things to contribute, but we have more information than they did. We know they used extra biblical evidence when they would interpret the scripture. The question is, will we use extra biblical information today when we have additional information, even if it means we come to a different conclusion than some of the great theologians of the past? When you have more information, sometimes you have to come to different conclusions than they did in the past. So I hope this has been helpful. Be sure to like, subscribe, comment, do all the things. Go ahead, pick up my book. You can get it at Amazon.com. It's called Divorce Your Remarriage, where you'll find all this information and a lot more behind this view. So thanks again for sticking around. If you have any comments, leave them in the comment section and I'll check them out. Thanks.